what tended to happen when you change the wafer size from 200 millimeter to 300 millimeter is that you don't build any new 200 millimeter factories. So so therefore all new investment tends to go into the bigger wafer size. And in fact, what also happens is that a lot of the 200 millimeter factories actually get shut down because they're no longer needed. Those products have migrated to the larger wafer size. So once we had the transition during the 1990s, what you found is that the amount of capacity in 200 millimeter dropped quite a lot. Because all the memory production went to 300 millimeter, a lot of logic production went to 300 millimeter, and all it was left with was the products that were only really applicable to 200 millimeter, analog mixed signal, some power devices, smaller volume devices where you couldn't justify or you didn't need the technology advantage of 300 millimeter. And so it dropped and it stayed there. But suddenly the demand for 200 millimeter products started to increase. And that was driven primarily by automotive and by MEMS devices and by some analog devices. And so the demand has been growing, but production hasn't been keeping pace. And the reason why production hasn't been keeping pace is because no one was going to build new 200 millimeter equipment. The equipment companies didn't want to. They wanted to sell 300 millimeter equipment because it's more expensive, they get more revenue. So to them, 200 millimeter was no longer terribly attractive. And so you had a limited supply. People were buying secondhand equipment from factories that are closed down, but eventually that runs out. And now there is no secondhand equipment left. It's all been effectively used up. So you're now having it very hard for people to expand their capacity because they can't buy the equipment. And when supply is more than demand, who cares? But once demand is higher than supply, then you have a problem. And then you get into a shortage and immediately you find prices increase. That will happen quite quickly. And that's what we're seeing now. The supply and demand balance has been very delicately balanced over the last 2 or 3 years. But in that period there, demand has always kept in touch with supply, either because of an economic issue or more recently because of COVID. And so all the while that we were just getting to the point whereby supply and demand were becoming unbalanced, we tipped back again and it was okay, hovering on a knife edge. But since the third quarter of this year, the COVID situation wasn't as catastrophic as we thought it would have been in the first quarter. The automotive market in particular has recovered. Electric vehicles have expanded very rapidly in this last half of the year. And all that's put pressure on 200 millimeter supply. All fabs are sold out, even in Malaysia and places which were really not very competitive. All fabs are sold out and people are putting prices up 10%, 20%. And next year they'll go up even more. Because there's no way out of this dilemma. The only way out is to build more factories. And that takes 2 years. Even if you could build a factory, it takes 2 years. 200 millimeter for sure, yes. 300 millimeter is not quite as bad. 300 millimeter is different because there are less suppliers. And those suppliers that are left are much closely managing their supply situation. They're able to balance supply and demand much easier because the memory people know their handful of customers. TSMC knows its customers. They know their customers and they have very, very tight supply arrangements with those customers. And so it's much easier to keep that balance of new investment with demand on an even nature. Much easier to do. So you won't have a supply limited problem on 300 millimeter. You will have some seasonal and some minor disruptions, but they'll be very much on the surface, unlike 200 millimeter. With 300 millimeter, they are adding new capacity. They're just balancing that new capacity addition much closer to the supply, the demand, than they can do on 200 millimeter. You can balance that much better because, TSMC, for example, requires a customer commitment before they'll put in the capacity. So they already have the fab committed before they built the factory. So there's never an oversupply, there's never an undersupply of any real consequence. There's always going to be minor disruptions because, demand is very instant, but supply takes 2 years. So you have one part of the equation which can change quite rapidly, and the supply side doesn't. It takes 2 years to build a new factory, so that's a very slow process. But demand is much more seasonally sensitive, and it's unclear how you are going to add capacity. You can add capacity by phasing some products from 200 millimeter onto 300 millimeter, and that frees up capacity, but that's quite slow to happen. If you're a foundry, you have many customers for which to balance your loading. Whereas if you're an IDM, you only have customers that you deal with, and they're much harder to balance. Because if one customer lets you down, it's much harder to find another customer to take up that slack, because each of those customers has their own build schedule, and so the sum can never equal one. Okay, I mean, you're always going to be slightly under capacity. Very hard to actually for an IDM to balance their product line, and that's why foundries have an advantage. They can always be full because they can always turn away a customer they don't want. They've always got customers that they can go to, either by offering a better price or by doing some other tactical movement there. It's much easier for a foundry to be fully loaded quicker. There's always the lead time because it takes 4 months to go through the fab cycle, 3 or 4 months to go through the fab cycle. So there's always going to be a small disruption, but it's much easier to find a new customer with a foundry than it is for an IDM. When they made the transition from 200 millimeter to 300 millimeter, all of the technology development stopped on 200 millimeter. And those technology improvements were only done on 300 millimeter. So 200 millimeter fabs are stuck in a ceiling. They cannot do beyond what they did 20 years ago, 10, 20 years ago. That's it, they're stuck. Which is good for MEMS, it's good for analog, it's good for power devices, because those technologies tend to be lagging behind logic and memory especially. So those technologies don't need the advanced technology. 150 nanometer, 180 nanometer is quite good enough for power semiconductor until we move on to compound, okay? And then that becomes a different kettle of fish. But those technologies were good on 200 millimeter. But if you're building logic or if you're building memory, you have no choice but to go to 300 millimeter because you can't make those products on 200 millimeter.